Ryan? Committee will come to order. Now, I'm going to yield to the first person that walks in the room, but you do understand the advantage of being the chair and back here first. We were talking about a little bit earlier about IG empowerment, but the GAO, which is a part of this branch of government, does all this work again and again and again. But, Mr. Kaminsky, maybe looking at it a little more from the IBM and the private enterprise standpoint, even recognizing we have limitations in our branches and our separation, is there a fundamental problem in that administration after administration doesn't have, if you will, the continuity of government to really go after some of the deep problems and fix them? Well, Congress doesn't take an active role in oversight, meaning the GAO is almost the controller, the honest ombudsman, and yet it has no authority. Congress, for the most part, and you saw it earlier in the discussion on CMS, for 20 years ignoring a law as to how much you could reimburse, and 35 times giving reimbursement amounts greater than the law allowed without recourse. Do any of you have institutional changes, in other words, major government reform changes that you believe structurally would help us and our successors do a better job here in this body for the benefit of the executive branch?
If you're looking at specifically IT or?
Well, we could look at IT. The Data Act that we're trying to get out of the House again and get the Senate to live up to creates more transparency and easier recognizing of the problems. Ms. Norton, I understand while I was out over at Judiciary, talked in terms of the RAT Board and how they were able to look through and identify misspending better than in the past. Those would be examples of structural change where you actually have a process change that makes accountability easier.
Well, there's several broad conceptual frameworks, and part of it is how do you create incentives to do the right thing, to do the win-win that you mentioned earlier. And one of these is disclosing hidden costs. And these are the costs that are buried into programs that are just accepted unless somebody asks a question about them. But you can't ask a question about them unless you can see them. Some of these in state and local governments are using budget capital charging. In other countries, there was a very interesting initiative in New Zealand probably about 20 years ago that they had to budget explicitly for all capital costs in the agency and had to pay like interest to the government if you had capital that you had. And if you didn't use it, you didn't want to be paying this interest charge on it. So you would.
So it was sort of define your CapEx, define your ROI, and pay on it.
Well, that was for the agencies that actually had the ability to do some sort of revenue charging. For example, the Forest Service in New Zealand they were given a target of a 6% return to the government for whatever their activities were, with exceptions for, like, you can't chop down, Yosemite Park type things.
I knew a politician who once said it was a renewable resource, and he didn't win that election.
But what was interesting was by creating this incentive for people to look at excess capital costs because they were being charged for owning them, they would get rid of automatically things that were excess buildings. The New Zealand embassy here sent a painting of Queen Elizabeth back saying, we don't need it, we'll deal with the print. We don't want to have to pay the capital costs on.
Okay, that certainly would be a game changer. Let me ask a question. Many decades ago, before John Dingell was in Congress, there was a Hoover Commission. And my understanding is it's the poster child for the one-time reorganization worked. Is it, in your opinions, time to do that again, to have that kind of a continuity of big thinking, reorganization at all levels, and then a continuity of doing it through multiple administrations. Mr. Blair?
Mr. Chairman, I think it is time for that kind of big thinking. I think you need to look at what government does. I think one of the things that you can look at, you have a menu of options available to you, from looking at within the departments and agencies themselves and looking at overlap and duplication. But I would urge you to look at government as from a unitary or a corporate perspective and saying, what are we actually trying to do? In my testimony, I built off the GAO list of overlap and duplicative programs. And some of those are intentionally duplicative. As I said in my testimony, you want belts and suspenders on some programs because you want to avoid program failure, or you want to avoid the risks associated with program failure.
But is that the reason we do breast cancer research at DOD?
That's exactly the question. It's like, do you need,
or is it just because we can stick a little funding there?
And DOD, and now you fund breast cancer research through the Postal Service. So you can look at these kinds of,
but they deliver.
These kinds of issues. That's right, they do 6 days a week. But I know that
5 very soon.
That's right. So what you can do is, and one of the efforts that we've been involved with is it's called Smart Lean Government, and it takes a look at these programs and say, what's the most effective way of delivering on these programs? That you don't need multiple agencies or departments doing the same thing with similar programs and similar mandates in order to accomplish the delivery of the service to the constituency group. If you eliminate that duplication and overlap, you can achieve savings while avoiding cutting the actual benefit. For instance, veterans health care. How many agencies are involved in something like that? Do you need that many agencies in order to get that final benefit down to the veteran?
Well, I want to thank you.
That's a prospect for
And I promised to yield as soon as someone came in, so I'll get to you, Mr. Schatz. Mr. Collins, I'll go to you in a second. I just wanted you to know, the question was, is it time for a Hoover Commission again? And the answer seemed to be yes. And Mr. Schatz, if you could be brief.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate that. And I agree with Mr. Blair that this is something that should be done. It has been a long time. Of course, the Grace Commission, from which CAGW arose and was kind of the predecessor to our work, looked at more waste than reorganization, although there was certainly some reorganization. And also looking at a Sunset Commission, which has been very successful in the State of Texas, where for every dollar that's been spent on the sunset process, taxpayers have saved $29. They've abolished 78 agencies, 37 completely abolished, 41 transferred or moved into new agencies or existing agencies. That's another way that the programs can be evaluated and agencies can be evaluated over time.
Great idea. Second only to closing law offices. Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity. I thank you for being here. This is, I think, going to be one of the big topics as we go on government spending, and I have several questions, so I'll start, Ms. Alexander. In your prepared testimony, you stated that loan guarantees for 2 nuclear reactors at Plant Vogtle in Georgia are analogous to loans given to Solyndra. However, there's a major difference in the two situations. Solyndra was a startup company based on unproven technology with no history and assets to protect taxpayers. In the case of Plant Vogtle, in my home state of Georgia, the loans are backed by a 100-year-old A-rated investment company with $25 billion or more in assets. In the case of Plant Vogtle, taxpayers also have first lien to recover taxpayer money. Expansion of nuclear power will not only help lessen our dependency on foreign oil, but it provides a steady, cost-effective source for power for customers. Having dealt with this in different ways in Georgia, based on these facts, is it not comparing apples and oranges when you're looking at these types of loan guarantees?
I don't think that it is comparing apples and oranges. I should just be clear for the record that our organization opposed the Title 17 loan guarantee program in 2005. We've opposed it all the way along the way. We think that the taxpayer protections in the program are just inadequate across the board. Our concerns specifically about the Vogtle loan guarantee really go to the fact that it's been a conditional loan guarantee where there's renegotiation after renegotiation without real transparency for the taxpayers, and it's a lot of money. You know, that's just, I mean, it's just
Don't disagree, but I think, because in the word of hyperbole, and which is thrown around these halls very quickly, comparing a startup company with absolutely no history to a company that's been around forever, that is publicly traded, you know, that's publicly regulated and others, I mean, I get the prospect. We're okay with where we're at. I think the Title 17 needs some issues, but are we not being a little hyperbolic when we state that and we put it in with Solyndra?
I mean, we didn't put it in with Solyndra.
You did.
Title 17.
You did in your testimony.
I did in my testimony, and I will again, I'm sure. But I
Okay,
don't
well,
want
is that
to
not
back off
apples
from
and
that
oranges?
statement. But I'm just saying the Title 17 loan guarantee program was created and expanded to include lots of different kinds of technology. It is the Title 17 loan guarantee program that we believe puts taxpayers at risk. There is not a single project in the pipeline that we don't have concerns about because we think the program does not adequately protect taxpayers. And time and again, the protections we've seen for taxpayers we think have been eroded.
Okay. I get your point. I think my concern is we're, especially in this situation here with a lot of transparency that's been going on back where there is protection that has been made for this, and especially in the two countries. My concern is you're just simply overgeneralizing to make a point, and that's my concern there. I agree with you on the need for better consolidation, better treatment of that. It just struck me as very odd when you start comparing a very political favored industry such as Solyndra, which there was a lot of bad issues there, as compared to, say, you or I when we were 17 and a loan given to us then when we had nothing, to now when we probably have a decent backing. So I just wanted to state that for the record. I believe it to be apples and oranges. Ms. Schatz, I have a question for you. As a state representative in Georgia, I had authored a bill that consolidated state agencies. It was one of the things that for the first time in history, as a Republican, we actually were able to follow through on what we believed, and that is it limited government, smaller government, and we were able to do that. On this committee, we've discussed ways in which taxpayer funds can be saved through IT reform. Maybe a bigger question here, redundant services, redundant stuff. Is there a way that we can, I know this has been discussed some more, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on, do you see potential cost savings through consolidated services or maybe even, I'll go on and say, entire agencies?
Well, I think that every program should be examined to determine how it should function in today's world, which is what the Little Hoover Commission has been doing in California, also similar to, I imagine, the sunset process in Texas and other states. But, you know, in software, for example, agencies have hundreds of software assets that are unnecessary or excessive, particularly in licensing. GAO issued a report in July of 2011 noting that 15 agencies did not list all of their software assets in their reports. Software is expensive, of course, and certainly if it's unnecessary, it shouldn't be purchased. The IT budget is $80 billion, and this committee had a hearing a week or two ago identifying almost $20 billion in annual waste. We favor investment and modernization of information technology, but not when it is not managed properly. And that's true of how the money is spent in all agencies. The problem is listing all of the duplication and overlap, as GAO has done, is helpful, but without an evaluation of which of those programs are effective, Congress just keeps adding new programs.
One last little follow-up, and this is a specific, and that's why I'm looking at it from, let's put a bill out there, and let's let them fight over it. Let's decide which is best, which one needs to be run, and which one doesn't. I'm not, and I believe in the end, if one proves better than the other, then that's the one that wins. But if they both prove to be inadequate, then we may have a situation where we get rid of the entire program. So I appreciate your comments there, and I think that's something we can definitely look at. The taxpayer's not going to have. So it's something I'm going to be looking at greatly.
Mr. Collins?
Mr. Chairman.
Could you yield for a second?
Oh, definitely, Chairman.
Mr. Alexander, I want to follow up on his question and ask it a little differently, his first question. Regardless of the challenges and the safeguards of the Title 17, if in fact a company has substantial skin in the game, very substantial, doesn't it in general reduce that risk? In other words, with Solyndra, they were operating to a great extent on our money, and some of the other entities even started with their money and then got a loan or a grant and substituted Federal money for the money that in fact they had. Isn't the gentleman's question valid that if in fact any program the government does with the private sector has a large percentage of skin in the game, that reduces the risk of failure simply because those companies are at least going to invest their money generally more wisely?
I mean, I don't mean to gloss over the fact that there are operational differences between the Solyndra loan, where the credit subsidy cost was covered by an appropriation, and Vogel, which will have to cover the credit subsidy cost. We have concerns about the calculation of the credit subsidy cost. We have concern about whether or not their skin in the game is sufficient. It's 90% of or 100% of the loan. We're very concerned about the credit subsidy cost calculation. So yes, there's a difference between whether or not you have zero skin in the game. That's worse. I agree. But we still think this is not good.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate the clarification. And Mr. Horsford, welcome to a committee that asks these kinds of questions a lot.
Thank you.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and it is an honor to be on this committee, and particularly at a time when we are trying to find every way to responsibly balance the budget while protecting the most essential parts of services that are provided. And as a former state legislator in Nevada, that was what we had to do over the last 4 years with 30% less revenue, was to basically comb through the budget and find areas that we had to cut back on. And I look at all of these issues and say that everything really needs to be on the table for consideration and discussion. And so specifically, I'd like to ask that during these challenging economic times, there have been certain companies, I'll use oil and gas companies in this example, who have remained highly profitable. Taxpayers for Common Sense issued a report in May of 2011, I believe, that described these record profits. And in the report it said, and I quote, in 2008, Exxon posted the largest annual corporate profit in U.S. history. Chevron became the second most profitable company in the United States. Shell, Exxon, Total SA, BP, and Chevron together made a total of almost $150 billion. So even with these profits, oil and gas companies continue to receive tax breaks and other corporate entitlements. The Office of Management and Budget estimates that taxpayers could save more than $43 billion over the next 10 years if these corporate entitlements were repealed. So my question to Ms. Alexander is, do you believe that the oil and gas companies should be getting these tax breaks and corporate entitlements? And if not, how should Congress deal with that?
We have been on the record for a long time against the oil and gas subsidies, whether through the direct spending or through the tax code. We've always treated subsidies through the tax code the same as financing mechanisms and spending mechanisms, or at least on equal footing in terms of analysis. So we would say, the last in, first out accounting, prohibiting the use of that in U.S. tax returns is something that we think should be prohibited for all businesses, but is a particular benefit for oil and gas. The intangible drilling cost, tax deduction is something that we would also support repealing. All of the subsidies that are listed in our 2011 report are things that we would be very happy to see Congress repeal. I will note that VTEC, which did go to oil companies, but also to the benefit of corn growers, has been eliminated, and so that's awesome. I think that this is one of those very difficult issues because we work on energy subsidies, and we work with members from both sides of the aisle. There is kind of a starting point of, when we say we think tax breaks that are targeted towards individual industries or significantly benefit individual industries are subsidies. A lot of times we talk to people who just don't agree with that statement. We think that. We've been doing this for 17 years. We think that. So we think that's something you should look at, of kind of how are we picking winners and losers through the tax code? How are we picking winners and losers through spending? So we look at energy subsidies across the board, and for industries that have been profitable for so long and that have been around for so long. These are mature industries. It's hard to understand why we need to continue to give them the kind of tax preferences that they've received for 100 years.
And as a follow-up, Mr. Chairman, if I may, can you give any specific recommendations for ways that the Department of Interior can improve its oversight on the royalties that are provided to oil and gas companies?
I'd be happy to follow up on the record with kind of longer, detailed responses to that, because that's something we've given a lot of thought to. I think certainly in the reorganization of the Department of Interior since the Deepwater Horizon spill, we've seen some movement towards improvement in terms of making sure we hope we're getting better enforcement and collection of royalties from both offshore and onshore drilling. I think that the terms of leases need to be very carefully examined to make sure that we're getting a fair return on any kind of development on public lands. But we'd be happy to kind of give you the kind of specific recommendations that we've advanced over the years and work with you further on that.
Thank you.
The microphone. And then the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Duncan. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This is my 25th year here, and I can tell you that when I first came, our national debt was, I think, 2.8, 2.9 trillion, and I thought that was too much. I was voting to reduce spending even then, and now it's 16 trillion, 400 billion, and they tell us under the most optimistic scenario it's going to go to 20 trillion, probably more realistically 22 trillion in the next 4 years. And we just passed major legislation that the CBO says is going to add another 4 trillion to our debt over the next 10 years. I mean, it's just incomprehensible, and I think that's the problem. But I remember Edward Rendell, when he was mayor of Philadelphia, and of course later became governor of Pennsylvania, he was having trouble with city unions when he was mayor, and he testified, I think, in front of one of our committees, and he said government does not work because it was not designed to. He said there's no incentive for people to work hard, so many do not. There's no incentive for people to save money, so much of it is squandered. And, you know, I've always remembered that, and I think the problem and the reason there is so much waste, people are spending money that's not coming out of their own pockets, and there's just not the incentives to save money. There's not the same incentives or pressures that there is in the private sector. And I'm wondering, I'd like to ask all of the witnesses, do you know of ways that we could create more incentives for federal employees to save money? I mean, we hear these stories. For years, we've all heard stories about how agencies use 60% of their budget the first 11 months and then scramble around the last month to try to spend it so they won't be cut the next year. Can we come up with a program to give federal employees bonuses if they hold down or save money within their particular agencies or programs? Mr. Schatz, how long have you been here?
I've been at Citizens Against Government Waste since 1986, and we certainly appreciate your voting record because most people who come to Washington end up voting for more spending over time. So,
yeah. So you've been here slightly longer than I have.
Longer, yes. Even before that. Worked on the Hill before that.
Yeah.
But I mentioned earlier the idea of having some kind of remuneration for either individuals or agencies that go out and either save money or collect money. Unfortunately, we probably need that kind of incentive to do a better job of managing our money. So that's something we've always supported.
Anybody else? Yes.
Mr. Duncan, I've been in Washington first with GAO since 1977. So
wow.
I have seen a lot of changes over time. And when I was given the opportunity to work for Vice President Gore, his deputy for reinventing government, this very issue was something that he raised. And there were pilot gain-sharing programs in some agencies that were used that if they were able to save money, they were allowed administratively to give that money either back to the employees or to invest it in, for example, an upgrade in their technology in the office or to paint the office or something. So it was done as a team rather than as individuals. Another thing that was done, this is in the 1990s, is the Vice President said that a lot of employees are more than willing to do something if there's some recognition. And so he created something called the Hammer Award, which was given to teams of employees that were able to put customers first, cut red tape, or to cut costs. And that award was given to about 1,400 teams. And as we were doing this over a period of years, we said there's some savings associated. And we'd asked agency budget officers to calculate behind each team's award what kinds of savings were accruing or cost avoidances, and it totaled about $50 billion. And this wasn't something that came from Congress. It wasn't an IG report. It wasn't GAO. It wasn't OMB. It was the employees themselves.
And you said $50 billion with a B.
$50 billion. So in part, I think employees, if given the inspiration or the incentive, are more than willing to do something. And many of the employees, I had the opportunity to actually deliver some of these awards in ceremonies around the country. And there were people in tears saying, I've worked for 30 or 40 years for the Federal Government, and nobody has ever told me thank you.
Well, we've got to do more in this way because this debt problem gets worse and worse. And I can tell you, many cities around the country have had to come in and cut their pensions. Well, the Congress won't come in and cut Social Security, but we'll just print more money and more money and more money. And pretty soon, these veterans' pensions and Social Security, they won't be able to buy anything. Mr. Blair, you want to say?
I do, Mr. Duncan. I think you bring up a good point, and you can look at it from more of a micro level of look at the Federal compensation system. It rewards longevity, not performance. There are ways of changing that, and it's difficult. There are a lot of employee groups and unions that oppose that, but at the end of the day, compensation is the single largest tool you have in order to spur performance, and so it needs to be more performance-oriented. And it was interesting, we were talking about, I've heard this expression several times tonight, this afternoon, skin in the game. I think you need to give some agencies some skin in the game to reward them if they're doing a good job in managing and functioning well. And you have this high-risk list that's coming out. Well, you've been here since 1986. I started in 1985 on the predecessor to this committee. So, and I've seen a lot of this. And it seems like every year, with every time the high-risk list comes out, we bring the agencies, or the Congress brings the agencies up, fusses at them, and then nothing really happens. We throw some money at Congress, throw some money at them to correct a problem, but you've got to have some real consequences. And I think that at the end of the day, is the largest issue in government is you've got to hold people accountable. Right. And this diffusion of accountability by saying, well, if an agency head doesn't do this, let's give an authority to this person, or you've got to hold the individual accountable. So I think that, but apart from, you can look at it on multiple levels, but at the end of the day, it's about accountability and holding agency heads accountable and making sure they're answerable to Congress and holding Congress accountable as well. I mean, look at the budget process. It's been in shambles for years now, and I think that's just one of the things that can be done to strengthen that accountability.
Well, I appreciate your testimony. I know my time is up, but I will say, since it's a veteran panel, that when I tell some of the newer members that I've been here this long, they look at me, it sort of boggles their minds, but I will tell you, they'll be amazed at how fast the time passes. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Duncan. Let me just pick up real quickly, and then I'll turn to Mr. DeSantis. So you can incentivize, as the panel talked about and as Mr. Duncan talked about, it seems to me you can also penalize. One of the things I'm reading that our majority staff put together is GSA sets a benchmark for what Federal agencies can spend at their conferences. The benchmark is $3,000 per attendee per conference, $6,000 per attendee per day. 183 times the Federal Government, the various agencies, went above the benchmark. In fact, 64 conferences that the Department of Defense held, they went above the benchmark. Social Security 22 times at 22 different conferences, Department of Energy 21 times. And, of course, GSA, which set the benchmark, went above the benchmark when they had their big shindig in Las Vegas. So it seems to me you can incentivize, but frankly, we should penalize them. One simple piece of legislation that, just after reading this here a few minutes ago, that I would be looking at doing is if you go above the benchmark and you spend more per conference, next year your budget gets cut by that exact amount. That's an incentive to do the right thing. I mean, that's the way everyone operates. You do something wrong, you should get penalized. So it seems to me we can do both of those as we're looking to save some dollars to deal with the $16.5 trillion debt that we now face. That's just me rambling. You don't have to answer that, but we'll go next to the gentleman from Florida.
Good afternoon. Over here, out in left field.
Hey, hang on. I messed up. I didn't see the gentlelady from California here, so we got to go back and forth. So she gets to go, then we'll go to you, and I won't interject next.
No problem, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan. I will join you in that amendment if you want to offer it on the floor, because, unless we start as a committee requiring accountability in these various departments, nothing is going to happen. And I am thrilled that each of you are here today to testify. If we spent the next year just implementing the recommendations that are in these great people's testimony today, we will have done something for the American people. The problem is that we know what the problems are. We just never effectuate the changes that need to take place. The Inspector General, the GAO, constantly tell us where we should be making cuts, where we should be making reevaluations, and we just never act on it. So we, as a Congress, have got to take some blame for what is going on. And I think this committee is poised to do the right thing. And we're poised to do it in a bipartisan fashion. And if we find a way to work together more on these kinds of, if we just take the recommendations that were presented here today, we will have done our work on behalf of the American people this year. So I hope that we can work together on that moving forward, and you can count me in on any of your efforts on that behalf. Let me just go back to something that's truly troubling, and any of you that have any perspective, I'd appreciate it. The fact that the Air Force wasted $1 billion on the Expeditionary Combat Support System, that it came before us as a Congress a number of times. I believe the GAO had made recommendations, and we kept allowing it to continue to ferment. And then finally, it only got pulled after the Air Force said, hey, this isn't working. But we had already spent $1 billion, and then on top of it, we ended up paying $8.2 billion as a parting gift to CSC for terminating the contract. Is that true? Or is it $8.2 million? Actually, this is a typo. It's $8.2 million in contract termination fees. So they screw up. We spend $1 billion of taxpayer money on a system that doesn't work. Finally, the Air Force says it's not going to work. We terminate the contract, and we pay them another $8.2 million. Does anyone have any perspective on why it got as bad as it did, went on for as long as it did without someone pulling the plug?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's not the first time, and although we hope it's one of the last times, because there have been many other examples of projects, programs, not just in information technology, but elsewhere, that go over budget. And unfortunately, since there are really no consequences for spending more money by Congress to hope the program works eventually, that's one of the reasons why they keep going. Because it's not just the agencies that continue to come in and say, oh, we need more. It's Congress that doesn't put their foot down and say no.
Exactly.
And so ultimately, it's not to lecture the committee or the Congress, but it is their responsibility as a body to say, this should just stop, and let's do something different, or let's just not do it at all. And unfortunately, it doesn't happen often enough.
I mean, I would say the one other thing I would add is I think that it's just incredibly important, and all we talk about in contract and acquisition reform is to have very clear consequences for failure to deliver what you say you're going to deliver. It's the cost of the termination fee was less than continuing the program, so that's the good news. But they didn't deliver what they said they were going to deliver, which ironically was to help the Air Force meet its audit requirements, which of course they still haven't done. So I think that we just need to make sure that in DOD, in particular, just because it's so large, but across the government, that when a contract is let to whatever service provider, that we have clear consequences, that we don't have to pay when they don't deliver. I think that's something that anybody who's been in business, if you enter into a contract with somebody, there are some areas that are gray of, did you give me exactly what I contracted for? But there's some areas that are not gray, where it's pretty clear. We didn't get what we paid for, so we shouldn't have to pay for the rest of it.
Mr. Chairman, I believe I've only got 20 seconds, but if I could, any kind of a discussion that we can have, a rational discussion on TRICARE would be greatly appreciated, because right now TRICARE is costing us extraordinary amount of money, and over time is going to eclipse what we pay in defense expenditures for, I believe, other personnel costs. And TRICARE is being paid for individuals who have retired from the military but are working in employment settings where they could get health insurance through their employer. And I want to know if you have any number as to how much that would save us.
We've done a little analysis, and we can follow up and send you some numbers on the record, but I think that this committee has a huge opportunity to play a role in that somewhat difficult conversation about reforming TRICARE. It shouldn't be that difficult, because of course we're going to take care of the people who have served the country so well, but we're subsidizing employers who have great employees who got trained by the U.S. government, and we should think about that before we continue to spend money on it. I think that it's just worth noting that Congress has actually blocked some efforts by the Pentagon to put in cost reforms to TRICARE. So it's important that this committee lead the way.
It's important to remember that up until the year 2000, those who retired from the military were in the Social Security system, and TRICARE is actually a fairly new incarnation.
I think the gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your testimony, and the material that you provided is great. After he got elected in 2008, the then President-elect, said that he thought it was important to go through the budget page by page, line by line, to eliminate unnecessary programs and to operate existing programs in a cost-effective way. As individuals who study this, has the administration ever put forward a list of these programs that needed to be eliminated? Have they actually eliminated any programs? Have they introduced some legislation in Congress to make good on this promise 4 years later?
Well, not to defend everything they've done, but there are certainly some education programs that appeared in the President's budget. National Institute for Literacy, Even Start, leveraging educational assistance partnership. Others have been eliminated by Congress, but in that case, maybe a few $100 million in savings. So every President produces a list of terminations. Unfortunately, Congress only adopts about usually less than $15 billion, often under $10 billion, less than 0.5% of Federal spending. But there are lists. Many of them have programs that have been around for, unfortunately, 10, 20, 30 years. And overall, it's a small percentage, but the answer is yes, there are lists that President Obama and others have put forward. They're just not large enough.
Okay. And they haven't been actually enacted into law by and large?
Some have. Yeah, there are some changes that have.
But it's in the hundreds of millions, not billions of dollars?
Well, again, just in the information we have on education programs, because that was the easiest to find, it's a few $100 billion, but overall, anywhere between 10 and 15 billion a year, I would say, gets adopted by Congress from the President's budget.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Mr. Congressman, the line-by-line review of a budget doesn't capture a lot of the costs that could be saved. There are system costs that are just hidden in the procurement system and the personnel systems, et cetera. But there's also costs or savings potential by looking at tax expenditures, which is an alternative way of buying things for the Federal Government or doing, and that's like almost $1 trillion, about the equivalent of the general discretionary spending each year. And there's also money that is hidden through regulatory costs that are in the hundreds of billions of dollars that you're shifting costs to the private sector that do things. There's also laws that are just hidden programs. For example, the General Mining Act of 1872 allows the miners to extract resources from Federal lands that cost far below the market value of the minerals that they're mining. So if you just restrict the look or the view only to what's in the discretionary budget, you wind up missing something that may be 2 or 3 times as large.
I totally agree with that. I appreciate that. I was just trying to isolate what has been done, where do we stand 4 years out, what more can we do. My second question is, we talk about individual items that can be cut. We talk about different things that can be done to save the Federal Government money. But I'm wondering, in your judgments, what is the capacity of this body and the Congress to actually follow through on some of these things? And I guess my point is if you look at the last several decades, it seems that the incentive is always to spend more. And I'm wondering if you think that we need an external pressure or constraint, such as a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, to finally get us on a path to fiscal solvency.
We've always supported a balanced budget amendment, but again, all of this could be done. It's a political will issue. And a good example of one project that was eliminated after 2010 that was kept in 2009 is the alternate engine to the Joint Strike Fighter, which before the change in control of the House, I believe it was about 230 members voted to keep it going. The Senate, by the way, always rejected it. In 2009, that vote took place, 2010, prior to the election. 2011, the vote was reversed. And so perhaps one by one, some of these wasteful programs can be eliminated. House has done a much better job of voting to reduce wasteful spending. It's simply gotten stuck over in the Senate. But I think it's all a matter of finding 218 votes in the House and 60 or so in the Senate that agree that these changes should be made.
What my final question is, I look through some of the materials about a lot of the improper payments. I mean, this is billions and billions of dollars, so it's a lot of good stuff that would be great to say, but I'm wondering to what extent is that something that you can just isolate and fix, or to what extent is that just simply inherent in the nature of a big bureaucracy, so that the answer isn't that we can simply identify this $10 billion in improper payments and snap our fingers, but we actually may need to simply reduce the size and scope of the bureaucracy as the best way to be able to save money?
I think there are ways of isolating certain of those improper payments. For example, paying dead Federal employees or their retirement annuities. I think that was highlighted in one of the recent reports that came out a couple of years ago, that we continue to pay these retirement annuities to people who died a year, 2 or 3 years ago. I think that if you go through each of these, that you can identify areas where you can actually make a difference now. But you are, with the government as large and as broad as what we have, you're addressing waste, fraud, and abuse. You have to look at in terms of the sheer volume, but you also have to look at as a holistic part of government. And it's something that we are going to have to live with. We just have to make sure that we have the processes in place that are stringent enough to keep it at a minimum. And that's what we don't have in place right now. Our government has grown up over the past 225 years to a point that if we were reorganizing government today, it wouldn't look at all what we have in place now. It would be a totally different function, but we have, through the years, departments and agencies reformed to respond to specific constituencies and to specific programs. And it's time to take a look at how government's administered and how government's organized in order to cut down on the systemic waste that we have seen over the past few years.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Let me go back to where I just was. And Mr. Schatz had said something earlier, and before we went for votes, if no consequences for wasting money, money will continue to be wasted. I mean, the one example that jumped out to me was the one I gave just a few minutes ago, where we had this benchmark, and 183 times various Federal agencies exceeded the benchmark. Ms. Spear and I are going to do legislation on that specific thing. But I just wanted to know, if there's no consequences, you're going to see money continue to be wasted, what other specific things, would you point to that we can get at where there are consequences for wasting taxpayer money? We can just get on the list.
Well, again,
down the line, I mean.
Well, one consequence would be to, again, penalize members of Congress who vote to waste money in some manner.
Well, that happens on Election Day. Yeah, I get that.
Well, that would help because, again, the Congress cannot fire people who overspend. They can change how the budget process works. What seems to happen, however, is when something is either not working or something is trying to be achieved, the STEM programs really strike me as the best example, because a third of those 209 STEM programs were added between 2005 and 2010, which means that both sides of the aisle were responsible. Somebody sees a science and math failure, we need to achieve more, we'll spend more. Spending money does not solve problems. So there's a fundamental change in the approach to spending. It's one of the reasons that one of the Grace Commission recommendations was to change the Office of Management and Budget to the Office of Federal Management. So the management comes first, the spending comes later, because the planning here is totally different than it is outside of Congress, where someone looks at a problem and says, can we solve it, how do we solve it, and then how do we either raise the money to resolve it, or can we afford to do this, or is there something else that exists that already achieves this? All the questions that really don't get asked. I'm happy to see that there now is this rule that identifies duplicative programs, because at least that information is there. It doesn't mean Congress won't vote to create a new program, but at least there will be more transparency on that, and then that may help in and of itself.
Anyone else?
I think in the context of contract reforms, I think looking at kind of when termination fees are, when contractors are entitled to termination fees.
That's a specific,
and looking, going back into the context of fixed price contracts, particularly for goods where kind of having the government as a client should be a pretty good incentive to keep your costs down. So looking at kind of some very specific things to make sure that contractors have, adequate skin in the game, to use the phrase of the day, but also just adequate controls so that we don't have to pay people who aren't doing what we want them to do.
Okay.
We talked about earlier more accountable pay system for Federal employees and also a reorganized government. But one of the things I would urge you to take just a brief look at is a project that the Academy worked on with the American Society for Public Administration. It's called Memos to National Leaders. It's intended to be addressed to both Congress and the administration over the next 4 years and identifying the toughest areas, toughest management areas in government. And some of the things to look at is better use of technology. We talked about real-time technology, more analytics, identify waste, fraud, and abuse, better use of social media to inform constituency groups. FEMA has used this in the past, but how about other agencies as well? We've talked about, one of the things that our memos talked about was strengthening the intergovernmental system. I said in my testimony that the actions at the Federal level reverberate on both the State and local level, and we don't seem to have here in Washington as firm a grip on this as we need, because we still have unfunded mandates that trickle down to the State and local level. We need to do a better job of recognizing the budget constraints that they have at the State and local level and really strengthen that Federal system, and so that while recognizing the independence that our State and localities have, the Federal Government, it should be a unified approach, at least with some of the programs. And there are ways of doing that, better collaboration, bringing people together with stakeholders together through online dialogues and other technological innovations. But the bottom line is that we really need to do a better job of communicating and highlighting the transparency and accountability of government.
Mr. Kaminsky, you want to comment?
Thank you. The emphasis on greater transparency is a good one. The overall goal should be tried to create some sort of incentive to save money. One of the things that's been interesting is a barrier for some of the savings that I mentioned that were around the back office administrative costs is because many of those savings are not scorable. And because it's not scorable, neither OMB nor the Congress seem to want to pay attention to them, even though there will be savings that result from them. There are processes to make things like that scorable, but it takes a lot of effort. So the transparency, by creating more scorable savings figures, can be a strategy that would help.
One last thing, and maybe what you've suggested is part of the Inspector General's reports, but we got 73 different Inspector Generals who, in 2011, their reports, when you total it up, is almost $94 billion that the government can save. It seems to me these are sharp people. They make good salary. They have staff. I think the average salary of an Inspector General is $165,000. Sharp people with working and identifying things. Do you agree with the Inspector General's report and the compilation of all that there's that kind of savings achievable? And if so, why, what do we need to do to make sure that happens? I mean, obviously, we need to pass a law or whatever, but give me your thoughts on that real quick. And I apologize if you talked about it before I was here, but let's just real quick do that, and then I'll let you all go.
Well, one of the things I'd look at in that Inspector General report, and I'm not that familiar with it, is I recall what I think is something like $75 billion in that was achieved through the savings of the Postal Service IG looking at the pension system.
Okay.
So if you take,
I've not looked at it.
And if you take that off, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but if you take that off the table, you look at the other instances of potential waste, fraud, and abuse. I think it's important to say that a lot of that is potential, and I think more work needs to be done in addressing and highlighting exactly what can be done, because I think that would give Congress a good blueprint from which to start. I would also urge you, in addition to the IG report, to look at this upcoming GAO list of waste and duplicative programs, because I think that gives you the starting point from which to ask, why are we continuing to do work?
Oh, I mean, we can do that anywhere. I just have done a little bit of work in the welfare reform area. We got, I think, 73 different means-tested social welfare programs. job training, education, nutrition, health care, scattered all over the various agencies in government. We might help families a little better if we didn't have 73.
And
So,
you might get that money to the families who need it.
exactly. No, that's the whole point.
Rather than going through 73 different agencies.
Save money and help more people. Imagine that. Yeah, imagine that. Mr. Schott.
Well, I think that's also an approach that should be taken in discussing what to do about duplication and waste. Because whenever someone talks about it, and we've all seen this over the years, well, we're going to, quote, unquote, eliminate, terminate, someone thinks they're not going to get something that they may or may not deserve, but certainly expect. But to show how more people will be helped through the consolidation of programs, through better management of programs, through more information about programs, is something that needs to be better communicated, I think.
Yeah. We're actually having a subcommittee hearing on that very subject next week.
Right, because it will enable members of Congress to feel a little better about talking about how these things are going to work and how people will be helped.
I just think the one other thing I'd say that I think this committee is in a position to do is factor in the duplication within the congressional process, because sometimes there's a lot of duplication in programs because there's multiple committees of jurisdiction, and this committee is in a unique position to do oversight over multiple programs that have jurisdiction of other committees, and that'll
win us a lot of friends with our colleagues.
Make friends and influence people, I know, but it is something that this committee can do in a unique way.
I understand. No, good idea. I had one other thing, and it's escaped me. I'm just curious, because I should know this, and our staff will work on finding this out. Is the scheduled sequester, the $85 billion in reductions in spending scheduled to happen in 20-some days, would that be the largest, one of the largest cuts government has ever implemented since I'd assume World War II, or in the modern times? Do we know? You all been, Mr. Schatz said you've been here 20-some years, and since '86, I'm just curious if you're.
Well, again, remember it's a reduction of an increase, so it's not necessarily a cut. It may be a cut for some areas, but maybe under Graham-Rudman, I don't recall what that number was.
That was in 1986. And
$100 billion, maybe, I think. I'm trying to remember.
But it didn't last. It was
right.
We know they don't. They never last.
Right.
We're trying to make some of them last.
For a period of a few.
Yeah, I think Graham-Rudman might have been larger, but not by much.
Okay.
Graham-Rudman was only for a few days, wasn't it? Didn't Congress act or that sequester? I can't recall.
We remember a lot more about how much they spent rather than how much they
You're highlighting the problem.
Must not have been a lot of pain.
You're highlighting the problem. I want to thank you all for being here. I know it's been a while and you had to break in the middle. We appreciate the good work you're doing and the work you've helped with the committee. We're adjourned.